Hi everyone, my name is Timothy Pintello, and this is the first video in my intended video commentary series. Before I get started, I would like to point out a feature I have included in these videos. On some of the slides, you'll notice that some points have numbers in parentheses next to them. When you see these parenthesized numbers, what they are endnotes for the references where I found some of the presented information. These references will be included in the description below the relevant videos if you're interested in following up with them. Now, the first book I would like to look at in my video commentary series is the book of Luke and Acts. Now, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are treated as two different books in the Bible. However, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to treat the two books as two different volumes of the same larger work. As I get started, I would like to go ahead and first discuss the author of these two books. The author of both volumes is generally considered to be Luke the physician, who was a known friend and associate of Paul the apostle. While neither one of the books actually mention Luke by name as the author, they do indicate that the same person wrote both. If we look at the we sections of Acts in particular, they show us that the writer was accompanying Paul at least during those parts of the narrative. By looking at the we sections in Acts and seeing who it states was accompanying Paul at those particular times, using the process of elimination, we can determine who the most likely person is that was the writer of the book of Acts and therefore the book of Luke. The result of using this process is that we can deduce that the writer is most likely Luke, the physician. The idea that Luke was the author of both Luke and Acts is also supported by a number of ancient Christian sources. The oldest source that we have indicating Luke to be the author of both books goes back to the 170 AD. This date is only about 100 years after the initial writing of the book. However, we'll actually discuss the actual dating of the book a little bit later. Now I want to address a statement I made a couple of minutes earlier, and that is that I'll be treating Luke and Acts as two parts of a larger work. The reason I am doing this is because Luke himself seems to do so. Luke shows this in how he introduces Acts in its first two verses, Acts 1, 1 and 2. Acts 1, 1 and 2 are as follows. The first account I composed, Theophilus, about all that Jesus began to do and teach, until the day when he was taken up to heaven, after he had given orders by the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. Looking at these two verses, Luke clearly states that he had composed a first account or work for Theophilus. This shows that Luke saw Acts as the second part or volume of a greater work he sent to Theophilus. Based on the introduction of Luke, Luke 1, 1 through 4, the Gospel of Luke is clearly the first account mentioned by Luke in Acts 1, 1. We'll look at the text of Luke 1, 1 through 4 in a later video. Taking the introduction of Luke and Acts together, we can see that Luke is writing both accounts to the same person, a man named Theophilus. Luke also does not bother repeating his justification or even his methodology in Acts 1, 1 through 2, as he does in Luke 1, 1 through 4. This shows that Luke already expected Theophilus to be familiar with his justification and methodology from the previous narrative he had given him. This indicates that it is very likely that Luke intended for Theophilus to read the two volumes one after the other, or at a minimum for there to be only a very short amount of time between his two readings. Taking Acts 1, 1 through 2, together with Luke 1, 1 through 4, it is clear that Luke and Acts were intended by Luke to be two volumes of a single larger work. Since Luke clearly intends that Luke and Acts be treated as two parts of a larger work, that's how I'll be treating them throughout all these videos on the books of Luke and Acts. Now this naturally brings up the question, why did Luke write Luke and Acts as two volumes? It's a reasonable question. Why did he do it that way? As it turns out, the reason Luke wrote Luke and Acts in two parts was because of physical necessity. In Luke's day, papyrus rolls came in standard sizes. The largest available papyrus roll was 35 feet long. Because of this physical limitation, Luke was forced to write up his work into two parts. The size of Luke and Acts are even roughly similar when measured by word count. The Gospel of Luke is around 19,400 words long, while the Acts of the Apostles is around 18,400 words long. With the size of limitations that we just mentioned, Luke had to organize his two volumes in such a way as to keep them proportional while still being able to smoothly transition from one part to the other. Looking at the text of Luke and Acts, it can be seen that this is exactly what Luke actually did. The first volume, the Gospel of Luke, centers around the life and work of Jesus Christ, ending in Jesus' death and resurrection. The second volume, the Acts of the Apostles, centers on the growth and spread of the church Jesus started. To accomplish this goal of discussing the church Jesus started, Luke further broke down Acts into two subsections. The first section of Acts focuses on the growth and development of the early church in what is today called Palestine, while the second section of Acts focuses on Paul's role in spreading the church outside of Palestine to the rest of the Roman world. Both Luke and Acts are needed to fully understand where the Christian faith came from and how it quickly spread throughout the Roman Empire. This is something that Luke clearly wanted Theophilus, who he wrote both volumes to understand. Next, I want to address the date of when Luke and Acts were written. The date for the writing of Luke and Acts is a bit unclear, but generally falls between the early 60s AD and the mid 80s AD, with a few outliers claiming it was written around 120 AD. I think there are actually several arguments for choosing an early 60s AD date rather than one of the later ones. First, there is no mention of Paul's letters indicating Luke and Acts were written before Paul's letters were collected. Second, neither Luke nor Acts make any reference to important events that happened after 64 AD. Some of these important events that Luke could have mentioned, and that might have actually been expected to mention, were the burning of Rome, and the war that went from 66 to 70 AD that resulted in the fall of Jerusalem, and ultimately that also resulted in the destruction of the temple at the end of that war in 70 AD. This last one, the destruction of the temple, Luke only tangentially mentions in Luke when Jesus is making a prophecy stating that there was going to come a day when the temple would be destroyed. There is no indication that this particular prophecy had taken place in the writings of Luke and Acts. If it had taken place, Luke is sure to have mentioned it, since it would have given extra credibility to his claims about Jesus. Third, Acts consistently portrays the Roman government as impartial, or at the very least indifferent towards Christians and Christianity. This indifference of Rome did not change until the late part of Nero's reign in 64 to 68 AD, and in the reign of Domitian from 81 to 96 AD. This is a strong reason to think that Luke and Acts were written before 64 AD when this particular attitude changed. Finally, Luke ends abruptly with Paul in Rome, staying in his own lodging, not a prison. There he is awaiting a trial before the emperor. This would have happened sometime around 60 AD or possibly even in the late 50s AD. By the end of Acts, this trial hadn't happened yet, because Paul's Jewish accusers had not yet shown up in Rome. According to Roman law, the accuser in a trial before the emperor had 2 years to appear in court and present their case. If the accusers had not turned up within the allotted 2 years, then the person being accused, Paul in this case, was allowed to go free. Also, in the case of a trial before the emperor, the accused was not kept in prison, but was instead allowed to find their own lodging within the city. The only restriction that was placed on them is that they were not allowed to leave the city or the environs around the city, and that they had to constantly have a Praetorian guard with them. As the epilogue of Acts 28:30-31 indicate, Paul had been confined in Rome in a rented lodging for about 2 years, meaning it was about time for Paul to be let go. The imprisonment that resulted in Paul's execution happened sometime later during the last part of Nero's reign, when Christianity stopped being tolerated. The second imprisonment and the execution in Rome is something we only know about through the writings of some of the early church fathers and is not the one recorded here in Acts. Personally, I feel that Luke and Acts were written sometime around 60 AD, give or take a couple of years for the reasons I mentioned. I feel placing the writing of Luke and Acts in the 64 to 68 AD time frame, or the even later, early 2nd century AD, as some people do, does not adequately account for the arguments just listed for the early 60s AD. Additionally, I don't feel that the later dates have any compelling unaccounted for arguments in their favor. Now, I'd like to go ahead and look at the historicity of Luke and Acts. By historicity, I mean how accurate Luke and Acts are when it comes to recording historical events. This is important because if Luke and Acts can be proven to be historically inaccurate, then it brings into question everything else written in these two books of the Bible. However, if Luke and Acts can be shown to be historically accurate on things we can verify, it brings credibility to those things that we are not able to verify at this time. Luke opens the Gospel of Luke claiming it is based on careful research about the information presented. While some have tried to raise questions about Luke and Acts historicity, wherever we're able to corroborate the historical claims made by Luke in either Luke or Acts, we have been able to do so far. There are also no known occurrences in Luke or Acts where Luke uses titles incorrectly or anachronistically. Both of these things argue very strongly for Luke and Acts' overall historical accuracy. Following, I have a list of titles used by Luke that show this overall accuracy in regards to titles. First, Luke states that Caesar Augustus ruled the entire Roman world in Luke 2:1. This is accurate. Luke also says that Tiberius Caesar was the ruler in Luke 3:1 and Claudius was the ruler in Acts 11:28. Again, these are all historically accurate dates that match up when Luke said they did. Next, Luke used the title Tetrarch for Herod Antipas in Luke 3:1, 3:19, and 9:7. This is also an accurate title and was the title that Herod Antipas was known by historically. The use of the term king for Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa I, and Herod Agrippa II in Luke 1:5, Acts 12:1, and Acts 25:13 are also historically correct because these men were kings appointed over certain regions by the Romans. Next, the use of proconsul for the leader of the province of Cyprus in Acts 13:7 is especially noteworthy because Cyprus was a territory under the direct rule of the Senate, not the emperor. And as such, it had a proconsul rather than a governor. This is an important distinction because it shows that Luke was familiar with the Roman system of governing and how it differed between provinces that were ruled by the Senate versus provinces that were ruled by the emperor. Next, the use of the title magistrates in the Roman colony of Philippi in Acts 16:20 is also historically accurate. It's historically accurate since the city of Philippi was directly ruled by the emperor and was not governed by the proconsul of the province in which it was located. Next, the use of the title politarch for the city officials in Thessalonica in Acts 17:6 was the correct way to address non-Roman civic magistrates in Macedonia. This is something that is only known from Macedonian inscriptions and is not found in Greek literature that we have from elsewhere. Yet Luke still managed to use these titles correctly. Next, we have the use of the title Asiarch, city clerk, and proconsuls in Ephesus in Acts 19:31, 35, and 38. This is especially important because of the role Luke attributes to the city clerk or the town clerk in Acts 19:35. In Acts 19:35, Luke states that it was a city clerk that stepped forward to quiet the crowd. This was something that could only happen in Ephesus and other cities in the Roman province of Asia, because in this particular territory, unlike any other territory in the empire, the title or position of town clerk held a great deal more political power and influence. In fact, the position of city clerk or town clerk was so high in political power and influence that in the province of Asia there are inscriptions that were often dated from the clerk's year in office, and sometimes a picture of the town clerk or city clerk's face would even appear on coins in Asia. Again, it is important to point out that this is something that only happened in Asia and nowhere else in the Roman world. This lends additional credibility to Luke because he actually includes these details that were not widely known throughout the Roman world when he was writing the book of Acts. Finally, in Acts 28:7, Luke calls the leader of Malta the chief official of the island rather than giving him some other title. This is accurate because during this period in Malta history, Malta was granted self-rule under the Romans, which means they didn't actually have any Roman officials that were over the island. All of these different titles are especially interesting to note because many of these titles have in the past been used to question the historical accuracy of Luke and Acts, because at the time of the questioning, much of this information was not known about the Roman Empire, but came to light later through additional study, archaeology, and the uncovering of additional inscriptions and documents. Finally, the historical accuracy of Luke and Acts can also be supported by the study of ancient sea voyages according to James Smith, biblical archaeology according to William Mitchell Ramsey, ancient Roman law according to A.N. Sherwin White, and classical studies according to F.F. Bruce. We will get into more of these specific areas as we come to them as we read the text and study the text of Luke and Acts. I will look at Luke's purpose for writing Luke and Acts in the next video, where we will begin looking at the text of the Gospel of Luke. In Luke 1:1-4, Luke gives us his reasoning for writing his own account to these events, even though other accounts he acknowledges had already existed.